The smell of jollof rice used to mean safety to me. For 26 years, every Sunday without fail, I sat at my father's table in the sprawling Adeyemi family compound on Victoria Island, Lagos. The table was long, mahogany, imported from somewhere in Europe that my father liked to mention twice in every conversation. 12 chairs. Crystal glasses. A tablecloth so white it made you afraid to breathe near it. My name is Emeka Adeyemi. And the last Sunday dinner I ever attended at that table was the night my father looked at me across all that white linen and crystal, with 14 family members watching, and said the words that would either destroy me or define me. He chose carefully, my father. Chief Bartholomew Adeyemi always chose carefully. He was not a man who made mistakes with language. He had built his reputation, his political connections, his entire social architecture on the precision of his words. So when he spoke that evening, with his fork still in his hand and his wine untouched, I knew he had rehearsed this. Emeka, he said. You are an embarrassment to this family. The table went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people trying to give privacy to a private moment. The sharp, electric quiet of people who had been waiting for exactly this. My mother, sitting at the far end, looked down at her plate. My older brother Tebena, who had never once in 31 years of living contradicted our father, reached for his wine. My cousins, 4 of them at that table, suddenly became fascinated by their food. And I sat there, 26 years old, wearing a shirt I had ironed 3 times to make sure it looked right, having driven for hours from Ibadan where I had just lost my second business in 18 months, and I waited for the rest. Chief Bartholomew Adeyemi was not a cruel man in the way people usually think of cruelty. He never raised his hand. He never screamed. His weapon of choice was something far more surgical. He used disappointment the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, deliberately, with full knowledge of exactly which nerve he was cutting. I have given you every opportunity, he continued, setting down his fork with a soft, controlled click. I paid for your education at Covenant University. I paid for your first business. I gave you contacts, connections, my name. My name, Emeka. Do you understand what it cost a man to give you his name and watch you drag it through failure after failure? I remember thinking, in that strange dissociated way the mind works when it's protecting itself, that the jollof rice smelled burned at the edges. Perfect at the center. Burned at the edges. I'm working on something new, I said. The logistics idea I told you about, if you could just give me 6 more months. 6 months. He said it the way you repeat something a child has said that has genuinely confused you. 6 months. Emeka, your age mates are running companies. Ton Foshola's son has just been appointed to the board of First Bank. Chibik Obi's daughter just sold her second startup for 200 million naira. And you are sitting at my table asking me for 6 more months to chase another dream that will end the same way the last 2 ended. Proper. Don't. One word. Flat and final as a door closing. The silence stretched. Outside, through the compound walls, I could hear the Lagos evening. Generators humming. Someone's music. The ordinary sounds of a city that did not know or care that my world was ending. I want you to understand something, my father said, and now his voice dropped, which was always worse than when it rose. Worse because it meant he was finished performing for the table. This was just for me now. I love you. You are my son. But I will not, continue to associate this family's name with failure. It is not personal. It is business. It is survival. Every association costs something. And you, my son, have become too expensive. I looked at him for a long time. Chief Bartholomew Adeyemi. 62 years old. Built like a man who had spent his youth doing things that required strength and his middle age doing things that required cunning. Gray at the temples. Eyes that were still sharp, still calculating, behind the reading glasses he only wore at the table when he thought no one noticed. He had built everything from nothing. That was the story. The legend. The foundation on which the entire Adeyemi identity was constructed. He had come from Anambra with 30 naira in his pocket and a secondary school certificate, and by the time he was 45, he owned 3 hotels, a construction company, and enough political relationships to make governors return his calls before breakfast. He had done the impossible. And he had never, not once, forgiven any of us for finding it difficult. Are you saying, I started? I am saying, he interrupted, that until you can sit at this table as a man who has built something real, something lasting, something that reflects the Adeyemi name rather than mocking it, you are not welcome here. The words landed differently than I expected. I had braced for pain. What I felt instead was something colder. Something clarifying. You're disowning me, I said. Not a question. I am giving you space, he said, to either become what you were born to become, or to disappear quietly. Those are your 2 options. I stood up. I want to tell you that I said something powerful in that moment. That I delivered some speech that foreshadowed everything that was coming. That I looked my father in the eye and told him in clear, precise terms that one day he would regret this. But the truth is, I said nothing. I folded my napkin. Placed it next to my plate, which I had barely touched. I pushed in my chair. And I walked out of that dining room, through the compound, past the security guard at the gate who had known me since I was 7 years old, and into the Lagos night. My mother called my name once. From the window. Just once. I didn't turn around. There is a particular kind of pain that has no drama to it. The pain of a broken bone, a car accident, a betrayal from an enemy, these things have a shape. They have a before and an after. You can point to the moment. You can say, there. That's where it happened. But the pain of being rejected by your father is formless. It has no clean edges. It seeps into everything. It rewrites the past as it destroys the present. I drove back to Ibadan that night, for hours, mostly in silence. I had a playlist I'd made for long drives, Fela Kuti, Wizkid, some American jazz my university roommates had gotten me into. I turned it off 20 minutes into the journey and drove in silence for 3 hours and 40 minutes. I was running calculations in my head. Not emotional calculations. Not the kind of processing people talk about in therapy. I mean actual numbers. Because that is what my father had reduced me to in that moment. Numbers. Balance sheets. Assets and liabilities. And I had been categorized, formally and finally, as a liability. So I sat in the numbers. My first business had been a small event planning company. Graduation parties, corporate dinners, weddings. I had started it at 23 with 200,000 naira of my father's money and a genuine belief that I understood what people wanted from their celebrations. I had been wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Quietly, steadily wrong. The kind of wrong that bleeds a business out over 14 months before you have the courage to look at the numbers and admit what they are telling you. My second attempt had been more ambitious. A logistics startup. I had seen, correctly, that Nigeria's e-commerce sector was growing and that last-mile delivery was broken. I was not wrong about the problem. I was wrong about my ability to solve it with the resources I had and the partners I chose. A co-founder who turned out to have a gambling problem. A key investor who pulled out at the worst possible moment. An operational error in the first month that cost us 3 major clients simultaneously. By the time I sat at my father's table that final Sunday, I had lost approximately 4 million naira, most of it his, and I had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 7 months. I was, in the language my father preferred, broke. But broke is not the same as broken. And it took me a long time, driving through that Lagos-Ibadan expressway darkness, to understand the difference. Broke is a condition. Broken is an identity. My father had tried, in that dining room, to make my condition my identity. And somewhere around the 3rd hour of driving, something inside me, some mechanism that I did not fully understand and had not deliberately constructed, quietly, without fanfare, refused. I remember the exact moment. The car in front of me swerved around a pothole and my headlights caught it just in time. My hands moved automatically, correcting the wheel. And in that instant of pure automatic response, that pure bodily intelligence operating without the interference of shame or grief or the echo of my father's voice, I felt something. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter than anger. Intention. I pulled over. On the shoulder of the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, which is not a place anyone who values their safety stops at 11:30 at night, I pulled over. And I sat in the car and I made a decision. I was going to become the kind of man my father had decided I could never be. Not for him. Not to prove him wrong. Not even to feel the satisfaction of watching his expression change when he finally understood what he had thrown away. Not yet. At that moment, it was purer than revenge. It was survival. It was the most basic human refusal to be what someone else has decided you are. I would build something real. Something that could not be argued with. Something so substantial, so undeniable, so completely and objectively successful that it would require no interpretation. And then, and this is the part one admitted to myself in that car, on that highway, then I would decide what to do with it. When I returned to my rented room in Ibadan that night, a room I shared with a man named Godwin who worked night shifts at a bakery, which meant I had the space to myself from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., I sat on my bed and I cried. Not the cinematic kind. Not the kind you see in films where a person weeps beautifully in the rain with their jaw set and their eyes dramatic. The ugly kind. The kind that shakes your whole body. The kind that comes from a place so deep you didn't know it existed until something reached down and pulled it out of you. I cried for about 40 minutes. And then I stopped. Because I am my father's son in at least this one way, I have a horror of waste. But those 40 minutes did something important. They showed me the size of the wound. And you cannot plan around a wound you refuse to measure. Parental rejection, particularly from a father, doesn't just hurt your feelings. It attacks your operating system. Because the first narrative you ever received about who you are and what you are worth came from your parents. Before you had language, before you had memory, before you had any framework for evaluating yourself, they were already evaluating you. And some part of the brain, the oldest, deepest, most irrational part, never fully stops believing their verdict. So when my father looked at me across that white tablecloth and called me an embarrassment, a part of my brain did not receive it as one man's opinion. It received it as fact. Delivered from the original authority. Stamped and filed. And the terrifying thing about that is it doesn't matter how intelligent you are. It doesn't matter how much you understand intellectually that one person's judgment, even your father's, does not constitute objective reality. The primal brain does not traffic in intellectual understanding. It traffics in safety. In belonging. In the oldest question every human has ever asked, am I enough? My father had answered that question. Formally. At the dinner table. In front of witnesses. No. You are not enough. Not yet. Not like this. And I want to be honest, a part of me believed him. That is the part of this story people don't tell. The part between the breaking point and the comeback. The months of waking up and having to fight, before you even get out of bed, against the voice that has been installed in you by someone you loved and trusted. The voice that knows all your specific failures. That knows exactly which arguments to make. That is not some generalized inner critic but a precise, personalized, intimate adversary that speaks in your father's cadences and uses your father's specific language. You are too expensive. I heard that sentence every morning for 4 years. Every single morning. The difference between year 1 and year 4 was not that the voice stopped. It was that I had, by year 4, built something loud enough to drown it out. 3 weeks after that Sunday dinner, I received a formal letter. My father had always been theatrical in a controlled, understated way. He did not send emails. He had a personal assistant, Mrs. Okonkwo, who had worked for him for 19 years and knew more of his secrets than any human being alive, who typed his letters on cream-colored stationery with the Adeyemi family crest embossed at the top. The letter was brief, elegant, devastating. It informed me that my name had been removed from his will. That the standing invitation to the family compound had been formally rescinded. That any financial arrangement previously discussed or implied was null and void. That he wished me well in my future endeavors, in quotation marks, I'm not sure if that was Mrs. Okonkwo's touch or his, and that he would appreciate if I did not make contact unless I had something substantive to report. Something substantive. I read the letter 4 times. Then I folded it precisely along its original crease lines and placed it in the front cover of a black Moskai notebook with a broken spine that I had found in a second-hand bookshop in Dogby Market for 200 naira. I did not throw it away. People ask me why I kept it. The answer is simple: it was the most expensive piece of paper I had ever received, and I intended to make it earn its cost. The first entry in that Moskai, dated 3 weeks after the Sunday dinner, read, "No more seeking. Only building. 10 years. Work in silence. Let success make the noise." That was it. No grand plan. No detailed strategy. Just the intention, written in pen, pressed hard enough into the page that I could feel the grooves on the other side. Before the strategy came the most important thing, the honest accounting. Assets: 1 laptop with a cracked screen covered in electrical tape. 1 Toyota Corolla, 2009 model, with a temperamental air conditioner and a front bumper held in place by divine will and cable ties. Approximately 80,000 naira in a savings account. 23 business books, most bought second-hand. The Moskai. Skills: genuine understanding of logistics and supply chains. Ability to read people. Ability to absorb information quickly. A network that was embarrassingly thin but not entirely useless. Liabilities: debt of approximately 1.2 million naira. No family safety net. No access to the social capital my father's name had previously provided. And one more thing. One advantage I almost didn't write down because it seemed too abstract, too internal, too impossible to quantify. Hunger. Real hunger. The kind that changes your relationship with time. I had watched wealthy people my whole life, and the thing I observed most consistently was how comfort softens urgency. How the knowledge that there is a safety net below you changes the nature of your leap. I no longer had a safety net. My father had, with great deliberateness, removed it. For the first time in my life, falling was not an option I could survive. I wrote that in the notebook too: falling is no longer survivable. Which means you will not fall. Godwin, my roommate at the Ibadan flat, was 34 years old, had a diploma in food science, worked nights at the bakery, and was quietly, methodically, without making any fuss about it, one of the most financially intelligent people I had ever met. I didn't know this for the first 4 months of living with him. Then one afternoon I came back to the flat to find him at the table with a spreadsheet open on his phone, cross-referencing something in a paper notebook, and I asked what he was doing. He told me he was tracking his investment portfolio. I looked around our shared flat. The peeling paint. The single ceiling fan. The kitchen where we shared cooking duties on a roster written on the inside of a cupboard door. What portfolio? I asked. Godwin looked at me for a moment, deciding something. Then he showed me his phone. Godwin had, over 6 years of night shifts at a bakery, accumulated investments in 7 different assets across 4 platforms. Shares in Nigerian banks bought during the 2008 financial crisis. A small plot of land in Ikorodu bought for 350,000 naira in 2015 and now valued at over 2 million. Money in 2 fintech savings platforms. A small stake in his cousin's tomato processing business in Kano. Total estimated current value, a little under 8 million naira. On a baker's salary. I asked him how. He said, I never spent what I didn't have. I always saved before I enjoyed. And I never tried to be rich fast. I tried to be rich slow and not die. I began having conversations with Godwin every evening before he left for his night shift. He taught me things no business school had taught me. Not theory. Practice. The arithmetic of patience. The mathematics of compound growth applied to a human life. He also told me something that became a kind of organizing principle for the decade that followed. The problem with people who want to be rich, Godwin said one evening, stirring his tea, is that they want others to see them becoming rich. They want the story happening in public. But money is shy. It doesn't come to noise. It comes to quiet. I wrote that down, money is shy. It comes to quiet. 6 months after the Sunday dinner, I made my first real move. The logistics sector was where I had my deepest knowledge and my most recent failure. Most people would have avoided it for exactly those reasons. I went back to it for exactly those reasons. Because I understood what had gone wrong, and I was no longer willing to let embarrassment make my strategic decisions. But I did not start big. That was the key difference. I started with a van. One second-hand Volkswagen Transporter with 170,000 kilometers on the engine, which I bought for 500,000 naira, most of my savings, plus a loan from Godwin that he extended without interest and without ceremony, just transferred the money and said, pay me back when you can. I had it serviced. I painted it white. I had a simple logo designed, just my initials, EAL, for Emeka Adeyemi Logistics, by a graphic design student at the University of Ibadan for 5,000 naira. And I started moving things. Pharmaceutical supplies from distributors in Ibadan to pharmacies in smaller towns within a 100-kilometer radius. Not glamorous. Not scalable yet. Not the kind of thing you announce on LinkedIn. Just moving things from where they were to where they needed to be, reliably, on time, without drama. Within 90 days I had 6 recurring clients. Within 6 months I had 3 vans and a full-time driver. Within a year I had 11 vans, 23 regular clients, and a reputation, small, quiet, local, for being the logistics provider that did not lose your shipment, did not arrive late, and did not need to be chased. I did not celebrate. I did not post about it. I did not call my mother, though I thought about it every week. I called no one in my family. I spoke to Godwin, who nodded and said, keep going. I kept going. In year 2 I moved the operation to Lagos. Leased a small warehouse in Apapa. Added medical and FMCG clients. Turned over 40 million naira. In year 3 I identified that the real money in logistics was not in operating the trucks but in owning the infrastructure that others used. I began acquiring small plots of land in strategic locations along major freight corridors, not premium land, not visible land, but useful land. Land near ports. Land near industrial zones. I used revenue from the operations business to buy the land, slowly, quietly, in company names that bore no trace of the Adeyemi identity I had left behind. In year 4 the land portfolio began to appreciate faster than the operations business was growing. I hired my first proper financial advisor, a woman named Adis, who was 43, who had worked for a decade at one of the big Lagos law firms, and who looked at my books in our first meeting and said, with a completely flat expression, "You've been doing this with no professional help. You're lucky you're not in prison." She became my CFO 18 months later. In year 5 I made my first move into real estate proper. A 12-unit residential building in Lekki Phase 2, funded through a combination of operating profits, land sales, and a bank loan that, for the first time in my life, I had the credit rating and collateral to actually receive on reasonable terms. In year 6 the real estate portfolio began to generate rental income that exceeded the logistics operations profits. In year 7 I moved into commercial real estate. Office buildings. Mixed-use developments. A small shopping complex in Ikorodu that became, within 18 months of opening, more profitable than anything I had built before. And throughout all of this, 7 years of building, of refining, of making mistakes and correcting them with resources instead of apologies, I did not contact my father. I did not contact him when the logistics business turned over 100 million naira for the first time. I did not contact him when the land portfolio crossed 500 million in valuation. I did not contact him when Adi sat across from me in our office in Victoria Island, the same island where my father's compound stood, and told me that the consolidated value of the Emeka Adeyemi group had crossed the 1 billion naira mark. 1 billion naira. Built in 7 years. In silence. I sat with that number for 1 full day. Alone. In my office, which had a window that looked out over the Lagos Lagoon, which at certain times of day turned a particular shade of copper that I had never seen anywhere else and that made me, in my quieter moments, feel something close to grateful. Then I thought about what came next. Because I had maintained silence, but I had not been blind. I had people, the cousins who were uncomfortable with what my father had done and who reached out carefully over the years, the aunt who sent me a birthday message every year without fail and who mentioned, in passing, the news she thought I should know. So I knew things. I knew that Tobena, my older brother, the one who had reached for his wine while my father disowned me, had made 3 major business decisions over the 7 years that had cost the family significantly. A hotel investment in Abuja that had gone badly. A political relationship that had soured. A real estate development that had stalled and remained unfinished for 4 years. I knew that the Adeyemi family compound had been quietly mortgaged, not once but twice, to service debts that my father had accumulated through bad investments in his late 60s as his instincts, once razor-sharp, had begun to dull at the edges. And I knew that the neighborhood around the compound, the broader Victoria Island enclave that my father had always treated as his natural habitat, had been slowly transitioning. Old money moving out. New money moving in. Younger investors, less sentimental about colonial-era properties, buying up the surrounding land and buildings. I had, without quite deciding to, been watching this transition for 3 years. And approximately 18 months before my 7th anniversary of silence, I began to realize something. A significant portion of the land and property surrounding my father's compound was available. Some already on the market. Some held by families who were open to the right conversation. Some held by companies in difficult financial positions. All of it, if assembled correctly, would form a near-complete ring around the Adeyemi compound. I sat with this realization for 6 months. I am going to be honest with you, what I was contemplating was not purely a business decision. It was a statement. An architectural, financial, permanent statement written in property deeds and ownership records. I could have bought property anywhere. I was buying property everywhere. There was no strategic need to buy specifically in this neighborhood. But there was a personal need. The underlying asset was sound. Victoria Island property was, and remains, among the most valuable real estate in West Africa. The acquisition made rational sense independent of anything personal. And the personal motivation was something I could live with, even if everything else went wrong. I made the first purchase 18 months before I contacted my father. Over the following 18 months, across 17 separate transactions conducted through 3 different subsidiary companies, I assembled what I privately called the ring. 11 properties in total. Various sizes. Various types. Residential buildings, a commercial plot, 2 older structures in need of renovation, 1 recently built office space, and the final piece, the one that took the longest to negotiate, the one I spent 6 months patiently waiting for the owner to be ready to sell, the property immediately to the east of my father's compound, sharing 1 wall of the boundary perimeter. No one in any of these transactions knew they were selling to Emeka Adeyemi, son of Chief Bartholomew Adeyemi, whose compound they were now being surrounded by. The sellers knew they were dealing with EL Property Holdings, a company with strong accounts, clean legal records, and a reputation for completing transactions without drama. Which was accurate. Just incomplete. By the time the last property transferred, I owned everything within 200 meters of my father's compound on 3 sites. I had assembled the ring. I called Adiz into my office on the afternoon the final transfer was confirmed and told her the full story. All of it. The Sunday dinner. The letter on cream stationery. 7 years of silence. What I was contemplating doing next. She listened without interrupting. Then she was quiet for almost a full minute. Is this legal? She asked. Completely. Is this wise? Probably not. Are you going to do it? Yes. She nodded. Then I need 2 weeks to prepare the paperwork, and you need to think very carefully about the specific mechanism. Because there's a difference, she said, between making a point and making an enemy. He's already my enemy, I said. He's your father, she said. Those are different things. Both can be true simultaneously. About 6 weeks before I contacted my father, when the ring was assembled and the plan was fully formed and Adiz had prepared every document and I had rehearsed, in my mind, approximately 1,000 different versions of how the next chapter would go, I sat in my office at 10:30 at night, alone, with my phone in my hand. And I almost called my mother. Her name is Chidinma. She was 58 years old. She had spent 34 years married to Chief Bartholomew Adeyemi, which had required a particular combination of strength and adaptability that I should have appreciated more when I was sitting at that table. She had called my name from the window. Just once. I had not called her back in 7 years. Not because I blamed her. I hadn't called because I was afraid. Afraid that hearing her voice would crack something in me that I needed to keep intact. Afraid that talking to her before I had something real to show her would feel like coming back empty-handed. That night, phone in my hand, I almost called her. I didn't. But I made a decision. I wrote it in the notebook, when this is done, call her first. 8 weeks before what I was privately calling the reckoning, I sent a message through a channel my father would recognize as legitimate, through Mrs. Okonkwo, his personal assistant, who was still there, still typing letters on cream stationery, because some things about Chief Bartholomew Adeyemi would never change. The message was brief. Please inform Chief Adeyemi that his son Emeka would like to request a meeting at a time and location of his choosing. The purpose of the meeting is to provide the substantive update previously requested. I used his own language. From his own letter. something substantive. I had waited 7 years to use those 2 words. The reply came 3 days later. Also through Mrs. Okonkwo. My father would meet me at the compound. Sunday, 3 weeks from the date of the message. 7 p.m. He would appreciate punctuality. I confirmed. Then I spent 3 weeks not sleeping well. Because here is what I had not accounted for. In all my planning, in all my preparation, I was going to have to see him. Not see him in the abstract. Not process him as a concept, a motivation, an antagonist in the story I had been telling myself for 7 years. See him. In person. In the room where he had looked at me across white linen and crystal and told me I was too expensive. I was 26 years old when he said that. I was 33 now. I drove to Victoria Island on a Sunday evening in March. The Lagos traffic was what it always was, biblical, without apology. I left 3 hours before I needed to, arrived 45 minutes early, and parked 2 streets from the compound and sat in my car. The car was different now. A 2023 Mercedes GLE, matte grey, clean, understated. Not flashy. I had thought carefully about what I drove to this meeting. I did not want to arrive like someone performing wealth. I wanted to arrive like someone who had forgotten that wealth was something you could perform. At 6:55 I got out of the car. The compound looked the same. Same walls. Same gate. Same security booth where a guard sat, a different guard than the one from 7 years ago, but in the same posture, with the same expression of mild professional suspicion until I gave my name. At my name, something changed in his face. Just a small shift. He called inside. Waited. Nodded. Welcome, sir. Sir. I walked through the gate. The compound at dusk. The big flame tree in the courtyard that I had climbed every Sunday as a child and that still stood, unchanged, enormous. The sound of the Lagos evening over the walls. The smell of jollof rice. My mother was standing in the doorway. I had not expected that. She looked older. 7 years of older. But she looked at me with an expression that bypassed 7 years entirely and arrived somewhere much further back, somewhere in my childhood, and her eyes filled immediately, without any preparation, and she said my name the same way she had called it from the window. Emeka. I held her for a long time in that doorway. She didn't say anything about where I had been. She didn't ask why I hadn't called. She just held on. Then she stepped back, looked at me with the particular assessment a mother reserves for a child she is reading for damage, and apparently found whatever she needed to find. He's inside, she said. He's been ready since 5. The dining room had not changed. Same mahogany table. Same crystal. Same white tablecloth. But it was set for 2 this time. No extended family. No audience. My father was standing at the head of the table when I walked in. He was 69 years old. He had aged in the way that powerful men age, not diminished exactly, but consolidated. The edges were softer. The frame was still large but no longer filled with the same forward-leaning certainty. His hair was fully gray now. The reading glasses he used to wear only at the table were on his face when I walked in, and he took them off, that same gesture, and set them beside his plate. We looked at each other. 7 years of looking at each other in our separate minds, in dreams and memories and quiet moments, and now here was the actual man, across the actual room. He said, Emeka. I said, good evening, Papa. We sat. He asked about my health. I asked about his. He asked about the drive. I said the traffic had been manageable. We inhabited, for 5 minutes, the complete formality of two people who were navigating a space that neither of them had a map for. Then he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and looked at me with those still sharp eyes. "You said you had something substantive to tell me." "Yes." "Then tell me." I took a breath. "Over the past 7 years," I said, "I have built a logistics operation that turns over approximately 300 million naira annually. A real estate portfolio with a current market value of approximately 4.7 billion naira. A holding company, EL Group, which consolidates these and 4 other subsidiary businesses. My current personal net worth, independently assessed 8 months ago, is approximately 2.1 billion naira. I said it the way he would have said it. Flat. Precise. Without drama. He didn't move. "You built this in 7 years, he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. And I watched him, with the particular patience I had spent 7 years cultivating, and I saw something happen in his face that I had never seen before. Pride. Raw, complicated, involuntary pride. It moved through his face like weather. And then, immediately, something else. Something that understood what that pride meant. What it acknowledged. What it cost. "You never contacted me," he said. "No." 7 years. "Yes." He picked up his water glass. Set it down without drinking. "Your mother." "I'll call her." "I should have called her." "That's a different matter." He nodded slowly. Then looked at me directly. "So, you have built something. Something real. Something I could not have done faster myself." He paused. "Why are you here? If you wanted to show me this, you could have sent a document through Mrs. Okonkwo the way I sent my letter. Why are you here, in this room, tonight?" I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a single sheet of paper on the table between us. He picked it up. It was not an eviction notice. I want to be clear about that, because I know what the hook of this story suggested, and I know what you were expecting, and I need to tell you the truth. I had prepared an eviction notice. Adis had drafted it. It was legally impeccable. For the property immediately east of the compound which his maintenance staff had been using informally to store equipment. It would have been technically legitimate. It would have been devastating in the way a precisely targeted thing is devastating. I had that document in my jacket. I chose not to use it. What I placed on the table instead was a property summary. A single page listing the 11 properties of the ring, their legal ownership details, their current valuations, and their relationship to the Adeyemi family compound. He read it slowly. He read it again. When he looked up, something had shifted entirely in his face. The pride was still there. The recognition was still there. But there was something new now. Something I had not seen in 26 years of being his son. Fear. Not of me specifically, but of what I represented. The thing that every person who has used power without conscience eventually faces, the possibility that someone they underestimated will build enough power of their own to make the original power irrelevant. "You own these," he said. "Yes." "You own the surrounding neighborhood. A significant portion of it." "Emeka." He set the paper down. "What is this?" "It's a proposal," I said. He blinked. "I own the neighborhood. I don't own the compound. I have no interest in the compound. I have no interest in making your life smaller, Papa. You did that to me. I'm not going to do it to you." I leaned forward. "I am proposing a partnership. EL Group and Adeyemi Holdings. I bring capital, operational capacity, and a real estate portfolio that can anchor a significant residential and commercial development across the entire area. You bring the land, the compound, the political relationships, and the name. My name, he said. Your name. Which is also my name. Which I spent 7 years building a different version of. And I'm offering to merge those two versions into something that is larger than either of them separately. He stared at me for a very long time. And if I say no, then I develop the surrounding properties independently, and you spend the rest of your career watching your neighborhood transform around a compound you don't have the capital to develop. That is also a viable outcome for me. I have run both scenarios. And which outcome do you prefer? I looked at him. I'd like my father back, I said. I'm 33 years old, and I'd like my father back. But I'm not going to beg for that. I'm offering a transaction. A real one. Between equals. The word hung there between us. Equals. Chief Bartholomew Adeyemi, who had built an empire from 30 naira and a secondary school certificate, who had never in his life sat across from anyone he considered his equal without it having been established through years of careful positioning and mutual calculation, looked at his son. And something in his face completed its journey. I was wrong, he said. Just that. Nothing more. No elaboration, no qualifications, no careful management of the moment for an audience that wasn't there. 3 words, from a man who I had never heard use those words in that sequence in my entire life. I said nothing. I was wrong about you, he said. I was wrong about what you needed. I was wrong about what I did. He picked up the property summary again. Looked at it. You bought all of this in silence. Yes. He almost smiled. Your grandfather used to say that the problem with this family is that we have always had too much ego and not enough patience. I thought he meant me. He probably meant both of us, I said. And something broke open. Not dramatically, not with tears or embraces or speeches. But something eased. In both of us. The particular tension of 7 years of unfinished business, held in the body, in the jaw, in the set of the shoulders, it eased. I will need to review the proposal formally, he said, slipping back partially into chief mode, because he was never going to be a different person entirely. With my own advisors. Of course. And there are conditions. There always are. He looked at me. You come to Sunday dinner. I looked at him. I'll come to Sunday dinner. The partnership was formalized 8 months after that Sunday. The Adeyemi Development Corporation became one of the most significant real estate development partnerships in Lagos State within 2 years of its founding. The neighborhood was transformed. The compound became the centerpiece of a mixed-use development that preserved its heritage architecture while surrounding it with residential and commercial buildings that generated revenue for both sides of the partnership. My father was credited, in several business publications, as having had the wisdom to recognize emerging talent within his own family and leverage it effectively. I let him have that narrative. Because I understood, finally, what total ownership actually meant. It was not about owning the neighborhood. I had done that. It was not about owning the conversation, making my father use the language of apology, forcing him to publicly acknowledge what he had done. I could have had that too. Total ownership, I had learned, was about owning yourself. Completely. Without requiring anyone else's assessment to confirm it. I had gone into those 7 years wanting, at various points, revenge, validation, the satisfaction of his regret, the warmth of his approval. But what I had built, the actual, material, concrete thing I had built, had been built in a period of such sustained focus and silence and solitary intention that somewhere in the middle of it, I had stopped wanting things from my father and started simply wanting to become the person I could see clearly in my own mind. That person turned out to be worth knowing. My mother and I spoke for 3 hours on the phone the week after the Sunday dinner. She said she had known I would be fine. She said she had prayed for me every single day. She said she had never stopped setting a plate for me on Sunday, even when I wasn't there. I asked her why she hadn't called. She said, "Because you needed to do this alone. And I trusted you to do it." I asked her if Papa had talked about me. In 7 years. She was quiet for a moment. "Every day," she said. I still have all 5 notebooks. The first one, the broken spine Moleskine with my father's letter pressed into the front cover, sits in a drawer in my office. I have not opened it in 2 years. The letter is still inside. I have thought, occasionally, about returning it to him. Not as a gesture of aggression. Just as an acknowledgement, here is the document that built everything you are now a partner in. Here is the exact artifact of the moment you tried to make me smaller and accidentally made me enormous. I have not done it yet. I may never do it. Because I have come to understand that the letter was never really from him. It was from fear. His fear that my failure would contaminate his success. His fear that the careful architecture of the Adeyemi name would not survive association with someone who had not yet found his footing. And you cannot return a letter to fear. Fear has no forwarding address. What I can do, what I have done, and what I will continue to do, is refuse to let anyone else's fear become my identity. My name is Emeka Adeyemi. I am 33 years old. I own a significant portion of one of the most valuable neighborhoods in Lagos. I am my father's partner. I am my mother's son. And I am, finally, after everything, my own.